CBSE Board, Class 11, History, Chapter 2, Part 8, Audio by Renee Matthew. Now we have to see a little bit of their domestic life, the Roman domestic life, gender, literacy, culture. Some of the modern features of Roman society was the prevalence of nuclear family. They did not have a joint family. They had nuclear family which involved the father, mother and the children alone. Even in spite of adult sons living with their families, it was exceptional for adult brothers to share a common household. So sons were living with their families, but still they had to share a common household. It was exceptional. Only few will do that, not everybody. Otherwise it was nuclear family. So slaves were also a part of the family, where it's not that they were treated as the family, but they were part of the family. As Romans understood this, because they couldn't live devoid the slaves. By the late Republic, that is the 1st century BC, the typical form of marriage came into existence, where the wife did not transfer to the authority of the husband. It is not that she was completely under the authority of the husband, but she retained complete right in the property of her natal family. She had rights to this family. It is not that the authority was completely or predominant over her. The woman's dowry as usual went to the husband and the family for the duration of the marriage, and she also remained a primary heir of her father, where she could inherit all the property of her father also, whatever the father gave, and also became an independent property owner on her father's death. So the father will come during the time of the marriage and the mother-in-law will get all the rights from the father. The father is expected to give the part of his share to the daughter at the time of marriage itself, and once he dies, she becomes an independent property owner also. The Roman women actually enjoyed some legal rights in owning and managing property. It was not as bad as the women in the French society or in the Indian society. They had some rights to own and manage property. The married couple was not one financial entity, but two. So what do you mean by that? The wife had some share and legal rights on the property, just like the husband. It's not that the husband alone had the right to the property. The wife also had. That is, women also had some right to the property. Legal rights was there. So that is why they were known as financial entity. One financial entity. These keywords are very important when you write the answers. And divorce was relatively easy in the Roman society, and it did not need more than notice of intent to dissolve the marriage. Now, we saw that in the Mesopotamian region also, that divorce was made legal. It is not that the society was completely against it. If you go by the legal rights, you can go for a divorce. That was the state of the Roman society. So people could do it in less than a notice of intent to dissolve the marriage by either husband or wife. One of them can approach the law and they can file the divorce. So when the males married in their late 20s or early 30s, the women were married off in the late teens or early 20s. That was the age group, which was the right and ideal age for marriage. There was a big age gap between the husband and wife because the women were married during their teenage years, that is in the early 20s, not like the men. So there was a big age gap between the two. And this would have encouraged inequality. It is not very easy for people to understand when you have a big age gap. So there will be some kind of inequality between the domestic life itself. There will be domestic quarrel which ultimately leads to separation. Now can you see a saint at the bottom of the screen? That is Saint Augustine. He is very important in the Roman culture and history. He was a bishop of the North African city of Hippo from 396, and he was a towering figure in the history of the church. especially the intellectual history of the church. And bishops were mostly very religious figures in the Christian community and very powerful. I told you that the church was very powerful, so you can imagine the status of the bishop also. Marriages were generally arranged in those days, and women were subject to domination by their husband. Authority was there, but it's not that the women did not have authority to the property and such kind of things, but domination was by their husbands in the family. Now, what is the role of Augustine? Because just now we saw that Augustine's name was mentioned in your textbook. He was a great Catholic bishop, and he spent most of his life in North Africa. He actually recounts a bit of his life, his own life. He says that his mother was beaten regularly by his father because men were actually dominating the family life, so regularly beaten, and he used to see that as a small boy. And most of the other wives in the small town where he grew up faced a lot of struggle, domestic quarrels and domestic ill health was prevailing in his town. And it led to similar bruises to the show. That is what he wanted to recount as a part of his life. And of course the fathers had substantial legal control over their children also, not only the wife, even over their children, and sometimes it went beyond the extent. Even now we can see that when the fathers have got, some of them, not everybody, when they have got all the control over the family, they can actually misuse it. Sometimes it happens with the women also. It becomes so shocking that a legal power of life and death and exposing unwanted children. So they used to just throw away the unwanted children and show such kind of cruelty towards their own children by leaving them out in the cold to die. So that was the power of the father, and nobody could even question that. So it was really unfair. What about the literacy? The rate of literacy. It is certain that rates of casual literacy varied greatly between different parts of the empire. We saw in the previous slides that everybody was not educated and knew how to read and write. It of course varied in different parts of the empire. Everybody was not literate. Everybody did not have access to every book and all those things, though Romans showed so much of interest. And we also saw that the Romans really respected the Greeks, and much of the literature came from the Greeks. For example, in Pompeii. Pompeii is a great city. Now this particular city was excavated by the archaeologists, and the remains were buried under the volcanic eruption in 79 CE. So when the eruption took place, most of the remains came up. That is how the archaeologists get access to the old remains of the city and they discover about the history. So here you can see that from a volcanic eruption, they got a lot of access to the city of Pompeii, and there is strong evidence of widespread casual literacy. Casual literacy means the basic knowledge of books and literacy. There were walls on the main streets of the city of Pompeii which carried advertisements, and that too intellectual advertisements and graffiti. Now graffiti and advertisements has become a part of education, media, and also great skill, right? Graffiti is encouraged. Earlier it was seen as a doom. Now it is like graffiti is a form of art. Everybody cannot do it. So the city of Pompeii had all the walls of its city covered with advertisements and graffiti which was found all over the city. And this is the city of Pompeii. It was discovered. And can you see all the remains? How everything was just seen. People were just buried like that. The bones were procured. Now in contrast, in Egypt, hundreds of papyri still survive from the ancient world. Most formal documents such as contracts were usually written by professional scribes. I told you about the professional people who could read and write, and only they could read and write and help the others to write the documents and the manuscripts. So they must have been paid fairly well for these kind of services. So here also we can see that the professional scribes were given the right to make contracts, and they were hired by the other people in the society to make documents and contracts, and often they tell us that X or Y is unable to read and write. So when they write for somebody, that is the meaning of this statement, when they write for some other person, what they do is, they will write at the end of the document that this person is unable to read and write, that is why I am writing it for him. So that message was usually conveyed in a very formal way. Literacy was actually widespread in Rome. People gave importance to literacy, but that was prominent among only a few groups in the society, like the soldiers, army officers, and estate managers, not amongst the normal people or the common layman. Only these people knew how to read. Of course, the others knew, but not so much. So that was the condition in the early Rome. What about the cultural diversity of the empire? It was reflected in many ways. Many ways it was shown. This particular point is very important. They can ask you to just elucidate on the cultural diversity of the Roman Empire, the ancient Roman Empire. The first point, in the vast diversity of religious cults and local deities, there was a lot of diversity in religious cults and local deities. The way they worshipped, the kind of culture that they followed, everything varied from one place to another. The plurality of languages that were spoken. It is not that they spoke all the language. We told in the beginning itself, we saw that Rome was a hub to so many culture. Diversity in culture and language was there. It was intricate. The detail was so much. So definitely they will have access to too many languages. So when language is different, the dress and costume will also be different. The food people ate also differed from one place to another. The forms of social organization, whether it is tribal or non-tribal, that also differed. The patterns of settlements also differed. The way they settled from one place to another. So these 5 points are very important because of the religious cults, local deities, the languages, dress, costume, social organization, pattern of settlement. Now what about their language? Aramaic was a dominant language of the Near East, at least west of the Euphrates. Can you see the Aramaic script over here? This is the Aramaic script. I've given it here. Then the other two scripts that were dominant, this was the most widely used script. The other two scripts that were used or spoken was Coptic and Celtic. Coptic was spoken in Egypt, Punic, and Berber in North Africa. Only these three places utilized Coptic. Celtic was spoken in Spain and the Northwest. These two places use Celtic. So Aramaic, Coptic, and Celtic. Much of the linguistic culture were purely oral, which meant that many did not know how to write. They just spoke these languages. But of course, scribes were there who knew how to read and write, because when you look at the script, it's not very easy to learn. It looks like symbols. It's not like ABCD. Looks very picturesque. And it's like you have to learn how to draw these things. Symbolic. So much of the linguistic culture were purely oral and not written. At least until a script was invented for them, it was actually oral. Only after they started using it on a widespread scale or on a large scale, they started developing the script for it. Initially, it was oral. Armenian, for example, only began to be written as late as the 5th century, not before that. Before that, they used to speak. Whereas, there was already a Coptic translation of the Bible by the middle of the 3rd century. So Coptic started its script, or people started using the script of Coptic as early as the 3rd century. But Aramaic was not like that. The script was developed late. But Aramaic became famous than the Coptic. Okay? Elsewhere, the spread of Latin. Latin was widely used because the church used Latin. Latin displays a written form of languages that were otherwise widespread. Everybody wanted to learn Latin. This happened notably with Celtic, which ceased to be written after the 1st century. So after the 1st century, they gave away with Celtic. Nobody used Celtic after that. After that, everything was replaced by Latin. Aramaic, Celtic, and Coptic. Very important script, and after that was replaced by the Latin. So I hope this particular part is very clear to you. Now what about the economic expansion? When we speak about the economy of Rome, it is definitely trade. Any place it is trade. Mesopotamians, everybody. Okay? So Mediterranean Sea, Euphrates over there, everything was helping them. Mediterranean Sea in Rome was very helpful in carrying their trade. The empire had a substantial economic infrastructure of harbors, mines, quarries, brickyards, olive oil factories, etc. So all these places, it had great infrastructure, which meant that it had a lot of facilities for harnessing these industries. It is not that the empire did not have place for all these small infrastructures. So many were there. Brickyards were there, quarries were there, mines were there. Look at the diversity. So much more was there. So it was the home for all these things. So you can imagine what was transported. Wheat, wine, olive oil. These three were traded and consumed in huge quantities. Very important point. And they came mainly from Spain, the Gallic provinces, North Africa, Egypt, and to a lesser extent Italy, where conditions were best for these crops. So why did they come from these places? Because it was ideal for growing them. The climate, topography, everything was favorable for growing wheat, wine, and also having the olive oil manufacture. So from there they imported and they carried the trade here. Now how did they transport? Look at this particular picture. Look at the attractive utensil over here. It is known as amphorae. So liquids like wine and olive oil were transported in these kind of containers. Amphorae. Very attractive. When it is painted, it looks so beautiful. So these were the ones that was excavated from the underground. The Romans used it. So we can see that this particular part shows the widespread use of many things. It was so rich, like starting from Pompeii, we can see how people just progressed and started growing. There was a lot of internal strife which took place. But economy, literacy, all these things were totally different from the other parts of the world. There was some broad-mindedness in Rome. Don't you sense that? From the gender, literacy and culture, when you sum up, every section will have a summary. When you sum up, you can see that as far as women are concerned, as far as literacy is concerned, all these things, people were more broad-minded. It was not like the other parts of the country. More broad-minded, and they gave more access to certain things, except for few things, which changed later. And also the economic expansion, it was not as bad as the other places. And people were interested in literacy and they wanted to get educated. And that is why even now, we are influenced by the Roman and the Greek culture. When you see any branch of study, we know that the Greeks and Romans have contributed so much. Literacy, any branch of study, it actually initiated from there. Art, architecture, and all these different forms of mosaic culture, everything comes from the Greek and Romans, even literature, sociology. It's like they contributed so much to these branches of philosophy. So even history, that is how we learned so much about the early forms of Roman life.